Hello, and welcome to Doing Life, a podcast brought to you by Cornerstone Church Bluffton. This week on the podcast, Pastor Mark talks about communication, how to be careful about how you say what you say, how to say it with grace, say it to benefit the other, and to say less more often.
Hey, welcome to the podcast. We are in episode 3 of our Doing Life podcast, our time together as we talk through some different issues. And as a church, Cornerstone Church Bluffton, we've been going through a series called Relationships. And in that, we actually meshed those two words together, the word real and the word relationships, because we feel like it's time we get real about our relationships. I'm Mark Devaney. I'm the senior pastor at Cornerstone Church Bluffton. Normally, Matt Bruns joins me on the podcast, but he is away in Orlando, Florida, enjoying some much-deserved rest with his family. In fact, I saw that he posted on Instagram and Facebook just a little bit ago that he loves Disney World and he does not care who knows about it. And Matt, I actually echo those sentiments. I too love Disney World, as does my family. So today, as we go through this podcast, I'm going to recap a little bit from my message on Sunday at church, and I want to talk specifically about communication in our relationships. It's really, to me, one of the most challenging parts of relationship, and I know for me, it's been one of the most challenging parts of marriage as well. My wife and I have been married for almost 18 years, and communication is one of those things that we've had to work at. But the truth is, in every relationship, if you'll work at communication, things can get better. Communication is something you can learn. It may not come naturally to you. My dad, for instance, is a very quiet individual, does not say much. So when he does say something, you probably should listen. But you can learn to communicate with other people. In fact, I was looking at some things just a little bit ago, and a couple of quotes just came up. One was George Bernard Shaw, who said the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And I started thinking through that and how many times I thought that I was communicating clearly with someone, only to discover that I was not. And so as I've grown up and matured a little bit, I try to take responsibility when I feel like things have fallen through the cracks, but also try to get to that place in my relationships and friendships, whether it's with the staff at church or friendships with just guys that I have around me or my wife. I want to work at being as clear as possible in my communication. The other thing that I heard said is that good relationships start with good communication. And so I started thinking through that just from that perspective, of marriage, but more so relationships leading up to marriage. And I remember when Carrie, my wife, and I were dating, we would have these really long conversations. Sometimes we'd be talking on the phone. Sometimes it would be face to face. But we talked all the time. And 18 years later, I can hardly remember the things that we talked about. But we both talked, and we were both really intentional. I think somewhere along the lines in a lot of marriages, people stop talking, and so you have to reclaim that a lot of times. With your relationships, that you're going to share information. In fact, just the other day, as I had come home from work one day from the office and was talking with Carrie, and all of a sudden I realized that I had been talking almost nonstop since I walked in the door. And I just looked at her and I said, "Do you ever get tired of me telling you all of these things?" And I thought maybe she would look at me and go, "Well, yeah, actually, I am kind of tired of you telling me all these things." But actually, she said, "No, in fact, I still think you don't tell me enough." And it made me realize I still have some work to do. I still have to work at communicating and sharing things with my wife in particular. But I want to talk just about Sunday in particular. So there's 3 places in Scripture that we went to this past Sunday as a church. And it really started with the idea of being careful about how you say what you say. And that came from what James wrote in the book of James, and talking through, how powerful the tongue is in our life, and how it can really bring destruction. And then going from there, we talked about how we can say things, or specifically what to say. And it went like this. The first one is that we need to say what we say with grace. Say it with grace. And that comes from Colossians chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, where Paul is writing. He says, conduct yourselves with wisdom towards outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. Let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so that you will know how you should respond to each person. And I started thinking about my speech. How does my speech need to be seasoned with grace? And what does that exactly mean? And so just looking at that a little bit, you think of grace, the unmerited favor, undeserved favor of God. And I think of when we say things with grace, we're going to say things with favor. We're going to say things that are acceptable and pleasing and beneficial. Those would be the way that would be the way that I would think of saying things with grace. And so, in all of our relationships, we have the opportunity to respond with grace. That when there's conflict in a relationship, you can respond in grace. You can decide that you're not going to give your initial response. And truthfully, when you think about responding in grace, you're not going to give your first response. That usually means you're going to pause and think about what you're going to say, because your initial response might be defensive, it might be judgmental, it might be any other way. This morning we had something happen at our home, and I didn't respond as gracefully as I should have with one of my kids, and that's so difficult when you're navigating through in the moment to just go, wait a minute, I need to respond here with grace, that it's beneficial, that it's showing favor to the person that you're talking to. And Paul honestly in Colossians 4, he's given us a warning to how we communicate with unbelievers. And so, man, how much more should we do this with those in our own family and those that are closest to us? So think about it that way. Say it with grace. When you're going to respond, pause. Don't get defensive. Don't get judgmental in how you're about to respond. The second thing we talked about Sunday was to say it to benefit. And it comes from Ephesians 4:29, and it's a really familiar verse that talks about let no unwholesome talk come out of your mouth or proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification, according to the need of the moment, so that it will give grace. Again, there's that word, that would give grace to those who hear. So I started thinking through that again this week and going, wait a minute, according to the need of the moment. And truthfully, as we mature as Christians, we should be able to identify these moments where we need to bring grace and bestow grace in the conversation. And that means that we're paying attention to what's being said. We're paying attention to what's going on in someone else's life enough to know how to bring this grace and this conversation into the moment. So say, for instance, you get home from work and you're able to identify what's going on with your family. Maybe it's been a little hectic for your spouse as you walked in the door. Maybe your kids have had a rough day at school. Anything like that, but that you're paying attention to those moments so that when you speak, you're bringing grace. You're not responding out of maybe your own frustration or your own anger or your own judgment, but you're responding going, wait a minute, I'm paying attention to the need of the moment, and I'm going to bring grace. I'm going to bestow grace on this situation instead of pouring more fuel on the fire, so to speak. That's a tough one, I know. Let no unwholesome talk come out of your mouth, but only what is good for the building up, edification, the building up for the need of the moment. That's huge. That in the need of the moment, you're showing up and you're going to build into this situation. You're not going to tear it down. You're not going to add fuel to the fire. You're going to be the one that's going to build it up. And it might just be block by block. It might be listening to one conversation. If you have a house full of people, you're going home, you're listening to one conversation, another conversation, and you're bringing grace into each and every one of those moments for people. And then the last thing we talked about Sunday, which I really believe resonated with the most people, came from James 1, 19 and 20. And it just simply says this: say less more often. Say less more often. And we all have a tendency to want to say more. But what James is telling us in James chapter 1 is that we should be basically quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. And when we're quick to listen, we're going to be able to discern the need of the moment. When we're slow to speak, we're going to be able to articulate how my conversation or my response in this conversation is going to be able to bring grace to the moment. And I'm saying these things that I'm thinking through all of the ways that I've blown it. I don't know if that's maybe what you're sitting there thinking, but I know when I've had some conversations with one of my children as they didn't want to go to bed at night, or they were just throwing a fit, and they're throwing a fit and I'm getting mad. And so things are escalating really, really fast in our home, and it just gets crazy, and those things spiral out of control. And wait a minute, I'm supposed to be the adult in that moment. I'm supposed to bring the grace. I'm supposed to bring maturity, and I'm responding like a child, just like my kids do sometimes. And I'll bet that I'm not alone in that. I'll bet some of you respond that same way. So we can learn to say less more often so that we can bring grace to the moment. Most of the time that means in our relationships with other people, we're going to learn to pause before we say what we're going to say. Last couple thoughts I just want to leave you with today on the podcast, and it has to do with a couple of verses that my mom taught me as a child growing up. And the first one's from Proverbs 16, verse 21, and it's really this neat picture. It says, "The wise in heart will be called understanding." But listen to what he says: "And sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness." That's a really cool way to say it. Sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness. Man, do I need that in my life, just to realize my sweetness of speech, the way I say, how I say it, what I say, those types of things. You realize, wait a minute, that's going to bring persuasiveness, sweetness of speech. You're going to put a little sugar on it, and you're going to be able to persuade somebody to do something. I'll bet there's somebody out there, I bet there's a wife out there listening to this who's been nagging your husband to try to get something done over and over and over again. And I want to say, hey, sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness. Don't get mad at me for saying that. You can get mad at Solomon, who wrote Proverbs. So don't get ticked off at me. But sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness. That's what it says. How cool would that be if we would change the way that we approached our conversations? And then the last one, Proverbs 16:24. My mom made me memorize it growing up, but it just simply says, "Pleasant words are as honeycomb, sweet to the soul, and healing to the bones." Think about it. Your words, what you say and how you say it, have the opportunity and the potential to bring sweetness to someone's soul and healing to their bones in ways that they've been hurt. Because words hurt, and I'll bet that all of us at one time or another have been hurt by something that somebody said to us or about us. And when we will be intentional about bringing healing through our words, that's part of bringing grace, understanding the need of the moment to say, no, I'm going to approach this differently, and I'm going to say this differently so that I can bring healing and sweetness to those that I'm in relationship with. So those are my thoughts just on communication in relationships. The other thing I just want to mention, just say what you mean. You know, when you're talking with people, sometimes we have a tendency to dance around some things. We don't want to sugarcoat it, but we want to pay attention to the way that we're saying and how we are saying it. And I guarantee when you work at that and you become a little more consistent with that in your communication and in your conversation with people that you're in relationship with, I'll bet things will change and things will get a little bit better. Thanks for tuning in today. We're going to finish our last message in our series on relationships this Sunday, and so we're really excited. We're going to talk about conflict, and it's going to be a lot of fun as we dive a little bit into Romans chapter 12, the last part of that chapter. Hope you have a great day. Thanks for tuning in.